I cut a lot from the Konosuba review that I did. I initially didn't want to make a part 2 of this, but then I remembered that there's literally no rules against revisiting a topic with all the digressions that I wanted to include, but didn't want to because the video would otherwise end up 45 minutes long. What's the algorithm gonna do? Punish my already niche channel nobody is interested in because of how oddly specific the subject matter is? Please. I survived 2 adpocalypses by doing nothing, because the people who want what I offer know how to find what I deal in. That said, enjoy these cuts I didn't serve up for the main course. The Konosuba tabletop role-playing game is a cash grab. At least in Japan it was. Probably also in the United States, but definitely in Japan. At least, this is what I speculate, since I can't rightly divine what the folks who signed off on the publishing of this were thinking on either side of the pond. Though I have plenty of evidence that shows that it wasn't a very high-effort affair. In Japan, there's a game system which is incredibly creatively named, called the Standard Roleplay System, and it is abbreviated SRS. It probably lands a little bit better for the Japanese, since that name is not a translation, it's literal English. It's like how some folks started using the term Dandori when Pikmin 4 came out, even though Dandori is literally just the Japanese word for planning or instructions. It just hit different for those of us who didn't know, or unbelievably stupid weeaboos. The Pikmin 4 digression aside though, Standard Roleplay System is culturally the equivalent of D&D 3.5 SRD, aka the D20 system. You want to make an RPG in a quick paint-by-numbers fashion? Use the D20 system. It has relatively well-understood concepts, but more often than not, a very hollow and soulless execution. And this kind of treatment still happens today with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, actually. There is no shortage of trend-chasing hucksters that will come up with a tabletop role-playing game and brand it with 5th edition RPG game compatible, because they're unwilling to pay the licensing fees to Hasbro, but want to speak the language of tabletop RPG dorks. And then if you crack open the book that they just sold you, it's just D&D 5e with a few class changes here or there. Some notable examples of this kind of shameless cash grabbing riding on D&D 5e's coattails are the Power Rangers RPG, as well as one version of the Dark Souls RPG. And trust me when I say this, there was a decent Dark Souls RPG once upon a time, and it actually did have some novel mechanics. This one just wasn't published in English. And sure, there are also a few good D20 system games that came out and that actually do something novel as well, like Mutants and Masterminds, but I digress. SRS is a bit like Japan's version of this. It has a few good games that fall under that framework, and a few disappointments, but after a while, you'll find yourself with a lot of them that are more or less the same game, even if they have a few different gimmicks when you move from one game to another, or that otherwise make them incompatible with each other. Among fans of Japanese tabletop role-playing games, Monotone Museum was one of the biggest such disappointments. It was made by an illustrator, specifically to prove that you don't need any sort of previous experience to make an RPG using standard roleplay system. And even though a lot of people were really excited for the premise, character creation was just picking skills that were things like, you do 2d6 fire damage. It had the potential to be novel, but was held back by its common garden variety paint-by-numbers rules. It's no different than the aforementioned Power Rangers RPG, which was just Dungeons & Dragons 5e sprayed in Power Rangers juice. Don't get me wrong though. We haven't really had any good games in the English-speaking world that are strict implementations of the standard roleplay system, even if we had plenty that use it as a basis. Double Cross, Kamigakari, and arguably Tenra Bancho Zero are the 3 that I consider before we got Konosuba, at least the ones that got official releases. And, as another digression, the degree that any of these can be considered standard roleplay system is something I've gotten into a lot of heated arguments about, since not everybody agrees with my more lax interpretation of the definition. But if this is your first time being introduced to the idea of SRS and Japanese tabletop role-playing game culture, a lot of this stuff is things you probably shouldn't be too concerned with. It's the sort of minutia that stupid nerds on the internet argue way too passionately about because there likely isn't much else in their life that gives them any meaning. Myself included. With that digression over, though, Konosuba is, as of writing this, the closest thing that we have in the English-speaking world to an official publication of an SRS game. And it's still a very poor example thereof, since Addendum and Allshard are much more robust versions of what Konosuba TRPG tries to be. Then, as one final gut punch before I wrap this up, there was also an Etrian Odyssey tabletop role-playing game, as in that Etrian Odyssey based off of the Nintendo DS games. And that was also a cash grab that used SRS.